Thank you very much, Mr Chair, and I have to confess I'm just refreshing my memory of the Gambling Amendment Bill number 2, and I would like to first of all acknowledge the Minister whose name is on the bill, the Honourable Rick Barker, a very competent and excellent Minister of Internal Affairs, and of course this bill was introduced back in 2007, and I'd like to congratulate him for his foresight. I would say, however, that one of the reasons this bill came about in the first place is that the then National Opposition were concerned that the Gambling Act, as it was originally called the Responsible Gambling Act, and after the Parliament was finished with it, it just became the Gambling Act because they decided that the word responsible no longer applied. But the National Opposition at the time was concerned that the Gambling Act was too prescriptive and that in fact it would date too quickly. And indeed that proved to at least be the case in some instances. So this amendment bill was introduced by Rick Barker in 2007 in order to try and keep up with some of the changes. I'm therefore delighted that given their concern about how quickly that the bill would date, the National Government have expedited this process, and 7 years later, after the bill was introduced, we're now making progress here in the House. And when you look at, if we turn to Part 1 in particular, and we look at some of the definitional issues that are covered by Part 1, it's very clear that the Act would date very quickly because of the technology changes that have come in since then. So when we talk about, we're talking a lot about gambling machines, and there's some technical provisions on that I know my colleague Stuart Nash is intending to speak about, so I won't steal his thunder. But there are other provisions here around electronic means, which I relocated again just before, and suddenly instant game, for example, remote interactive gambling. There's been huge technological advance since this bill was introduced, and in fact since the Gambling Act itself was passed back in 2003, that make this legislation necessary. I would of course point out that this, I think the Minister and the Chair, Peter Dunn, is now the fourth Minister to be in charge of this bill. Rick Barker introduced the legislation. Richard Worth, things didn't quite work out for him. He then picked up the legislation after that, and Chris Tremaine, I think, after that. And Peter Dunn, have I missed one? I must have missed two. I've missed a couple. So there have been a few other ministers along the way. Actually, no, I think Nathan Guy was the Minister for Internal Affairs for a little while there. So this bill has passed through many hands. Of course, it's a largely technical piece of legislation, and there are a variety of supplementary order papers designed to, I guess, try and bring the bill up to speed with what's happened in the 7 years since it was introduced. But it's a necessary piece of legislation because it deals with some loopholes and so on. I am aware that there's another gambling amendment bill also on the table, which I'm sure the Parliament will get to in due course. But if we could, the bulk of the provisions that I want to speak to are actually in future clauses of the bill. But what I will do is talk about, just to give you another example, things like FPOS device are better defined in here. Now, there was still FPOS 7 years ago, so I'm not sure what the change necessary there is. But there are a variety of changes that are being made that simply bring the law up to date with technological advances and changes that have happened. But I do want to talk about Part 1 under the Purpose Clause, because there's an amendment here. The very first amendment under the Purpose Clause, the first sub-clause, number 1, which changes the purpose of the overall legislation by omitting the harm caused by and substituting harm from. And this is something that I would quite like to have an explanation from the Minister about what on earth, what the justification for that is, because it seems to me that the harm from gambling could actually be more narrowly defined than the harm caused by gambling. And if one of the overall purposes of the Act, and I think if you go back and look at the original Act or the primary Act, is that we want to try and reduce the harm caused by gambling. And so I would like to know why the wording change there in the purpose. The wording now says it's around the harm caused by gambling, and it's being changed to harm from gambling. And it seems to me that the latter definition could well be interpreted as being more narrow than the definition that's in the Act at the moment. And so I'd like to know what the justification for that wording change. It may seem a minor change, but I'd like to know the justification.
Simon O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, pleased to take a call on this.